Now she regrets it. 8 years ago, I caught my husband cheating on me with my daughter-in-law. Today, at my son's funeral, they were smiling and hugging like a fresh couple. He leaned toward me and said, "So, I guess I won, huh?" I calmly replied, "Yeah? Well, meet my husband." When he saw a brand new Bentley pulling up, he froze. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Marcia, and I'm 66 years old. For 42 years, I believed I knew what love looked like. It had Lance's face, his laugh, his way of humming old jazz songs while making coffee on Sunday mornings. I thought I knew what family meant, too. Sunday dinners around our mahogany table, holidays spent watching our son Michael grow into a man, and eventually welcoming his wife Zadie into our circle. I was wrong about everything. It was a Tuesday in March when my world cracked open like an egg hitting concrete. I'd come home early from my book club because Eleanor had caught that nasty flu that was going around. The house felt different the moment I stepped through the front door, too quiet, but somehow charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. I should have called out. I should have made noise. Instead, something made me move quietly through the hallway, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors I'd polished just that morning. The sounds coming from our bedroom weren't immediately recognizable. At first, I thought maybe Lance was moving furniture. Then I heard her voice, breathy, urgent, and my heart stopped. "We can't keep doing this in their house," Zadie whispered. "She won't be back for hours," Lance replied, and his voice was different, younger somehow, alive in a way I hadn't heard in years. I stood frozen in the hallway like some pathetic statue, my purse still clutched against my chest, listening to my husband of 42 years plan his deception with my daughter-in-law, the woman I'd taught to make my grandmother's apple pie, the woman I'd comforted through 2 miscarriages, the woman I'd defended when Michael worked too many late nights. The betrayal felt physical, like someone had reached inside my chest and twisted everything until it no longer fit right. My breathing became shallow, my hands started shaking, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. That's when I heard Lance say the words that would haunt me for months. "Marcia's gotten so predictable, so old. Being with you makes me remember what it feels like to be desired." I backed away from the bedroom door, my legs barely carrying me. Somehow I made it to the kitchen, where I sat at the breakfast nook and stared at nothing. The clock on the microwave read 2:15 in the afternoon. I watched those green numbers change, minute by minute, until I heard movement upstairs. Zadie came down first, her hair slightly messed, her lips swollen. She had the decency to look startled when she saw me. "Marcia, I thought you were at book club." "Eleanor's sick," I managed to say, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. She nodded quickly, grabbing her purse from the counter. "I just stopped by to borrow that cookbook you mentioned, the one with the pot roast recipe." I watched her lie to my face with the same mouth that had been kissing my husband 20 minutes earlier. "It's on the shelf by the window," I said. Lance appeared a few minutes after she left, his hair damp like he'd splashed water on it. He kissed my cheek, and asked how book club had been. "Fine," I said. "Eleanor's got the flu." "That's too bad. What's for dinner?" I stared at this man I'd loved for over 4 decades. This man who was asking about dinner after betraying everything we'd built together. And something inside me went very, very quiet. "I thought I'd make pot roast," I said. That night, I lay in our bed listening to Lance sleep. He was snoring lightly, completely at peace, while I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what to do with the knowledge that was eating me alive from the inside. I could confront him. I could scream and throw things and demand explanations. I could call Zadie and tell her exactly what I thought of her. I could call Michael and destroy his marriage in one conversation. Instead, I got up quietly and went to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at that same breakfast nook, thinking, planning. By sunrise, I knew what I was going to do. Nothing. At least, nothing that would look like anything to them. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. I had to smile at family dinners while watching Zadie and Lance exchange glances. I had to listen to Michael talk about how much he loved his wife, how lucky he felt to have her. I had to pretend I didn't notice when Lance started buying new cologne, when he began working out again, when he started taking business trips that seemed suspiciously unnecessary. The worst part was watching Zadie comfort me when I seemed sad or distant. She'd rub my shoulder and ask if I was feeling all right, all while planning her next encounter with my husband. 3 months after I discovered their affair, they stopped hiding it. Lance asked for a divorce over breakfast, sitting at the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals. "I'm not happy, Marcia," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We've grown apart. I think it's time we both admitted that." I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl. "And Zadie?" His face went pale. "What about Zadie? Will you be happier with her?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, he nodded. "I love her, Marcia. I know that's hard to hear, but I can't pretend anymore." I nodded too, as if this was a reasonable conversation between two adults discussing the weather. "I see. And Michael? We'll tell him together. Explain that sometimes these things just happen. These things just happen. As if our 42-year marriage had been struck by lightning, rather than systematically destroyed by two people who'd decided their desires mattered more than everything else." The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Lance had been planning longer than I'd realized. Somehow, most of our assets had been moved into accounts I couldn't touch. The house we'd bought together, the vacation home in the mountains, even the antique furniture that had belonged to my grandmother, all of it slipped through legal loopholes I was too devastated to fight. Michael chose sides quickly. Zadie was pregnant again, and Lance was going to be the father she'd always wanted their children to have. I became an inconvenience, a reminder of an uncomfortable truth they wanted to forget. The last family dinner I attended was in November. Zadie was showing by then, glowing with the kind of happiness I remembered from my own pregnancy. Lance couldn't keep his hands off her, constantly touching her arm, her back, her growing belly. I sat at the end of the table, the same table where I'd hosted Thanksgiving for 20 years, and watched my replacement live my life. "Marcia looks tired," Zadie said to Michael, her voice dripping with false concern. "Maybe she should see someone. You know, for her health." Michael nodded seriously. "Mom, you've seemed really different lately. Maybe Dad's right about you needing help." Help? As if I was the problem. As if I was the one who'd destroyed everything. I excused myself early that night, and I never went back. But here's what none of them knew. I wasn't falling apart. I was falling into something else entirely, something they would never see coming. 6 months after that final family dinner, I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment across town, sleeping on a mattress I'd bought from a discount furniture store. Everything I'd accumulated over 42 years of marriage had vanished into legal documents I barely understood. Lance had played his cards perfectly. Years before I'd discovered the affair, he'd been moving money, restructuring investments, preparing for this moment. The family business we'd built together, a small but successful real estate company, was suddenly entirely in his name. The vacation house in Aspen that we'd saved for over a decade to buy was transferred to a trust that somehow excluded me. Even my grandmother's china, the pieces that had survived the Depression and 2 world wars, were deemed marital property that Lance needed for entertaining clients. "Your husband was very thorough," my lawyer had said, his voice tired after months of fighting losing battles. "Everything was moved legally. Technically, he didn't break any laws. Technically, that word became my nightmare. Technically, Lance had every right to leave me with nearly nothing. Technically, Zadie had every right to move into the house where I'd raised my son. Technically, my own family had every right to choose sides, and they'd chosen the side with money and a new baby. The isolation was the worst part. Michael stopped calling after the first month. When I reached out to him, his responses were short, distant. He was busy with work, busy with Zadie's pregnancy, busy building a life that didn't include his mother. "She's really struggling," I heard Zadie tell someone on the phone when I called looking for Michael one afternoon. I'd used my key to check on something I'd forgotten, a photo album from Michael's childhood. only to hear her voice drifting from the kitchen. It's like she's lost her mind. Lance is worried she might do something desperate. You know how older women get when they're abandoned. Abandoned. As if I'd been left on a doorstep, rather than systematically destroyed by people I'd loved and trusted. I stood in my old hallway listening to my daughter-in-law paint me as a pathetic, unstable old woman, and something cold settled into my chest. Something that felt almost like relief. They thought I was broken. They thought I was helpless. They thought I was exactly what Lance had called me that day in the bedroom. Predictable. Perfect. I started acting the part they expected. When I ran into old friends at the grocery store, I let my shoulders slump. I wore clothes that didn't quite fit right, let my hair grow out gray, spoke in the quiet, defeated voice of a woman who'd given up. "Oh, Marcia, honey," Mrs. Patterson from our old neighborhood said when she saw me fumbling with coupons at the checkout. "You look so thin. Are you eating enough?" I shrugged, letting my eyes water a little. It's hard to cook for one person. The pity in her voice was exactly what I needed. "Have you thought about, getting some help? There are programs for women like you. Women like me, discarded, forgotten, invisible." "I'm managing," I said softly. Word traveled fast in our social circle. Within weeks, everyone knew that poor Marcia was struggling, that the divorce had broken her, that she was barely hanging on. Lance and Zadie made sure to look appropriately concerned whenever anyone brought up my situation. "We've tried to help," Lance told our old friends at the country club, "but she won't accept support. Pride, you know. She'd rather suffer than admit she needs us." The lies came so easily to him, but then he'd been practicing for years. Meanwhile, I was learning. During those long, quiet evenings in my tiny apartment, I wasn't just surviving, I was studying. I read every financial magazine I could get my hands on. I took online courses about investing, about business, about the things I'd let Lance handle throughout our marriage because he was better with numbers. Turns out, I was pretty good with numbers myself when I wasn't being convinced I was too stupid to understand them. I also started paying attention to things I'd ignored for decades, like the fact that women my age were invisible in a way that could actually be powerful. Store clerks barely saw me. Waitresses overlooked me. Business meetings that I observed from coffee shops treated me like furniture. Being invisible meant being underestimated. And being underestimated, I was beginning to realize, was the perfect position from which to plan a comeback. The first step was small. I took the tiny settlement from the divorce, barely enough to cover my rent and groceries, and instead of just surviving on it, I started investing. Small amounts at first, careful choices, nothing that would raise any flags. I also started walking. Long walks through different neighborhoods, paying attention to properties, to development patterns, to the subtle signs that certain areas were about to boom. Real estate had been Lance's business, but I'd been listening for 40 years. I'd absorbed more than either of us realized. Within 6 months, I'd turned my meager settlement into something that could actually grow. Not enough to change my life yet, but enough to prove I wasn't the helpless woman everyone thought I was. The second step was harder. I had to rebuild myself physically, emotionally, mentally. I joined a gym in a part of town where no one would recognize me. I started taking care of my appearance again, but subtly. I couldn't let Lance or Zadie see me looking anything other than defeated. I also had to confront the rage that was eating me alive from the inside. Some nights, lying on my cheap mattress, I fantasized about exposing them, about screaming the truth to everyone who would listen. But rage was a luxury I couldn't afford. Rage made you sloppy, made you act too soon. What I needed was patience and planning. By the time Zadie gave birth to their daughter, my granddaughter, who I would never be allowed to meet, I had been invisible for almost 2 years. The broken, pathetic Marcia was firmly established in everyone's minds. Even I sometimes forgot she wasn't real. But late at night, when the world was quiet and I could drop the act, I felt something growing inside me, something that had nothing to do with the woman they thought they'd destroyed. I was becoming someone new, someone they would never see coming. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 years after I'd discovered the affair. Michael's voice was strained, distant, but he was calling me for the first time in months. "Mom, I need to tell you something. Dad and Zadie. They're getting married." I gripped the phone, my carefully practiced voice steady. "I see. When?" "Next month. It's going to be small. Just family." Family. That word again, redefined to exclude the woman who'd given birth to the groom's son. That's wonderful for them," I managed. "Mom?" Michael's voice was softer now, almost uncertain. "Are you okay? I mean, really okay? Zadie thinks maybe you should talk to someone. You know, professionally." Perfect. Even my own son thought I was falling apart. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." After I hung up, I stood in my tiny kitchen and allowed myself one moment of pure, blazing hatred. Then I breathed it out and got back to work. Because while they were planning their perfect new life, I was planning something else entirely. Something that would take everything they thought they knew about me and turn it inside out. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd broken me completely. They had no idea what was coming. 8 years. That's how long I perfected the art of being invisible while building something extraordinary. 8 years of letting Lance and Zadie believe they'd destroyed me completely, while I quietly constructed a life they could never imagine. Michael died on a rainy Thursday in October. Heart attack at 34 years old, sudden and devastating. The call came from Zadie, her voice broken and desperate. "Marcia? It's Michael. He's gone." I dropped the phone and fell to my knees in my apartment hallway. My son, my only child, the boy I'd raised and loved and lost to their manipulation, was dead. The grief hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over until I couldn't breathe. But even in that moment of pure devastation, a small part of my mind stayed calculating. This funeral would be the first time I'd seen Lance and Zadie in almost 3 years. They would expect to see the broken woman they'd left behind. They couldn't know what I'd become. The funeral was held at St. Matthew's Episcopal, the same church where Michael had been baptized 34 years earlier. I sat in the back row, wearing a simple black dress that made me look smaller than I was, my gray hair pulled into an unflattering bun. To anyone watching, I was exactly what they expected, the forgotten mother, the discarded wife, present only on sufferance. Lance and Zadie sat in the front row with their 7-year-old daughter Emma. Zadie wore designer black, her grief elegant and photogenic. Lance looked older than his 70 years, his hair completely white now, his hands shaking slightly as they rested on his cane. They thought they were the picture of dignified sorrow. They had no idea they were sitting in front of a woman who'd spent 8 years planning for exactly this moment. During the service, I let myself grieve honestly for my son. Whatever had happened between us, I'd loved Michael deeply. He'd been caught in the middle of something he never fully understood, manipulated by people who'd made him choose sides. Now he was gone, and with him any chance of repairing what we'd lost. But after the service, as mourners gathered in the church hall for the reception, I watched Lance and Zadie work the room like politicians. They accepted condolences with practiced grace, told stories about Michael that painted themselves as the perfect parents, while carefully omitting any mention of his biological mother. I stayed in the corner, accepting the occasional awkward hug from old friends who weren't sure what to say to me. I played my part perfectly. The sad, forgotten woman who was barely holding herself together. That's when Lance approached me. He walked over slowly, his cane tapping against the tile floor, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Even in his grief, he couldn't resist the opportunity to twist the knife one more time. "Marcia," he said softly, positioning himself so his back was to the crowd. "I'm surprised to see you here." I looked up at him with the tired eyes I'd practiced in mirrors for years. "He was my son, Lance." "Was he?" Lance leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear. "Because from where I sat, it looked like you abandoned him years ago. Like you gave up on being his mother the same way you gave up on everything else." The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. At our son's funeral, he was still finding ways to hurt me. "You know what I think?" he continued, his smile growing wider. I think Michael was better off without you. Zadie was a real mother to him. She was there for him when you couldn't be bothered. I felt something crack inside my chest, but I kept my expression neutral, broken, defeated. Lance straightened up, looking pleased with himself. So I guess I won, huh? I got the life I wanted, the family I deserved, and you got, well, whatever this is. He gestured dismissively at my appearance, my obvious poverty, my complete irrelevance to the gathering around us. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd shared my life for over 40 years, who'd fathered my child, who'd promised to love me until death do us part. He was gloating over my son's coffin, celebrating his victory over a woman he'd systematically destroyed. That's when I smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but Lance noticed it. His expression shifted slightly, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "You're right, Lance," I said quietly. "You did win." He nodded, satisfied, already turning away to rejoin Zadie and the other mourners. "But you know what?" I continued, my voice still soft but carrying a strange new quality that made him freeze. "I'd like you to meet someone." Lance turned back, frowning. "What?" I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. My movements were slow, deliberate, letting the anticipation build. "I'd like you to meet my husband." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Lance's face went completely blank. "Your what?" Instead of answering, I pressed a number on my phone. It rang once before a warm, cultured voice answered. "Darling, are you ready?" "Yes," I said, my eyes locked on Lance's increasingly pale face. "We're ready." I hung up and slipped the phone back into my purse. He's just pulling up now. Through the tall windows of the church hall, we could see the parking lot. Lance followed my gaze, his mouth slightly open, waiting for whatever pathetic display I was about to make. That's when the Bentley arrived. It was a brand new Continental GT, gleaming silver that caught the afternoon sun like liquid metal. The car moved through the parking lot with the quiet confidence of something that costs more than most people's houses. It found a space near the front of the church and glided to a perfect stop. Lance's face had gone from pale to ashen. His hands gripped his cane so tightly his knuckles were white. "That's impossible," he whispered. The driver's door opened, and Alexander stepped out. At 58, Alexander Camden was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. 6 feet 2 inches tall, with silver hair that looked distinguished rather than old, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Lance's car. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. More importantly, he moved like a man who was very much in love with his wife. Alexander's eyes found mine through the window, and his face lit up with a smile that made my heart skip even after 3 years of marriage. He raised his hand in a small wave, and I waved back. Lance was staring at the scene like he was witnessing something impossible. His mouth was opening and closing without sound, his entire worldview cracking apart in real time. "Who?" he started, then stopped. "How?" I looked at him with the same patient expression I'd worn for 8 years. "His name is Alexander Camden. Perhaps you've heard of him. Camden Industries, Camden Foundation, one of the largest real estate development companies on the West Coast." Lance's face went gray. Of course he'd heard of Camden Industries. They were the company that had been quietly buying up properties throughout the region for the past 5 years. The company that had revolutionized sustainable development. The company that Lance had tried and failed to secure contracts with dozens of times. "That's not possible," Lance said again, but his voice was barely a whisper now. "We've been married for 3 years," I continued conversationally. "The ceremony was small, just close friends and family. You know how I've always preferred intimate gatherings." Through the window, we watched Alexander lock his car and walk toward the church entrance. Even from a distance, his presence was commanding. This wasn't a man you ignored or dismissed. This was a man who shaped the world around him. "But how did you—" Lance started, then stopped again. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile the broken woman he'd left behind with the impossible reality walking toward us. I turned to face him fully, and for the first time in 8 years, I let him see the real me. Not the defeated victim he'd created in his mind, not the pathetic ex-wife he'd discarded, but the woman I'd actually become. "Did you really think I stayed broken forever, Lance?" I asked, my voice gentle but carrying an edge of steel he'd never heard before. "Did you really think you could destroy 4 decades of my life and I'd just accept it?" His mouth moved soundlessly. Behind us, the reception continued, but our corner of the room had become its own private universe of reckoning. 8 years, I said. 8 years of you thinking you'd won. 8 years of you believing your own story about the sad, pathetic woman you left behind. The church doors opened, and Alexander walked in. He didn't scan the room looking for me. He knew exactly where I was. Our eyes met across the space, and he smiled that smile again before making his way through the crowd of mourners. Lance followed my gaze, watching this impressive man navigate the room with natural authority, speaking briefly and respectfully to other guests before heading directly toward us. 8 years of me letting you believe exactly what I wanted you to believe, I finished. Alexander reached us just as Lance's world finished crumbling. My husband extended his hand to Lance with perfect politeness. "You must be Lance," Alexander said, his voice warm but measuring. "I'm Alexander Camden, Marcia's husband. I'm sorry for your loss." Lance stared at the offered hand like it might bite him, then slowly, mechanically, reached out to shake it. The contrast between the two men was devastating. Alexander, confident and successful and clearly devoted to his wife. Lance, aging and bitter and suddenly very, very small. "I don't understand," Lance whispered, looking between us. Alexander's arm slipped around my waist, a gesture so natural and loving that it spoke of genuine intimacy rather than performance. "Darling," he said to me, "are you ready to go? I thought we might stop by the house before dinner." The house, our house, the oceanfront estate in Malibu that Alexander had bought for us as a wedding gift. The house with more square footage than Lance's entire neighborhood. I nodded, suddenly exhausted by the weight of 8 years of pretending. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." As we turned to leave, I heard Lance behind us, his voice cracked and desperate. "Marcia, wait. I don't. How is this possible?" I paused without turning around. "You taught me something valuable, Lance," I said over my shoulder. "You taught me that the only person you can really count on is yourself." Then Alexander and I walked away, leaving Lance standing alone in the corner of his dead son's funeral reception, finally understanding that he hadn't won anything at all. The ride to our Malibu home was quiet, Alexander's hand resting gently on mine as his driver navigated the coastal highway. I stared out at the Pacific, watching waves crash against the cliffs below, and let myself process what had just happened. For 8 years, I'd imagined this moment. I'd played it out in my mind 1,000 different ways, always wondering how it would feel to finally drop the mask and let Lance see what I'd become. The reality was both more satisfying and more hollow than I'd expected. "How are you holding up?" Alexander asked softly, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. "I keep thinking about Michael," I admitted. "About all the years I lost with him because I was so focused on this moment." Alexander squeezed my hand. "You did what you had to do. And Michael, he was starting to come around, Marcia. Before he died, he was asking questions about what really happened during the divorce." I looked at my husband, this man who'd become my anchor and my partner in ways Lance never had been. "You think he would have understood eventually?" "I think he was already beginning to." Our house came into view as we rounded the final curve, a stunning contemporary structure that seemed to grow from the cliffside itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the setting sun, and the infinity pool appeared to spill directly into the ocean beyond. It was architectural poetry, and it was ours. But as beautiful as it was, the house represented something much more important than luxury. It represented the life I'd built from nothing, the empire I'd constructed while everyone thought I was falling apart. "Tell me about the beginning," Alexander said as we settled onto the terrace with glasses of wine. This had become our ritual over the past 3 years. He loved hearing the story of my transformation, and I loved telling it to someone who truly understood what it meant. I smiled. settling back into my chair. You mean the real beginning? The real beginning had started 6 months after my divorce was finalized. I was living in that awful little apartment, barely scraping by on the pittance Lance had been required to give me, when I decided to attend a real estate investment seminar downtown. I told everyone I was going to see a grief counselor. Instead, I spent 3 hours learning about property flipping, market analysis, and leveraged investments from a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd built a $20 million portfolio, starting with nothing but a maxed-out credit card and an eye for undervalued properties. The key, Patricia had said, isn't having money to start with. It's seeing opportunities that everyone else misses. That's when I realized something crucial. Being invisible wasn't just about people underestimating me. It was about being able to observe without being observed, to study without being studied. Over the next 2 years, I became a ghost haunting the real estate market. I would show up at properties as the sad older woman who was just looking or thinking about downsizing. Real estate agents barely noticed me. Sellers dismissed me as someone who couldn't afford anything significant. Investors ignored me completely. Meanwhile, I was learning everything. I discovered which neighborhoods were about to be rezoned for commercial development. I identified which properties were going to be in the path of new highway construction. I found homes owned by elderly people who needed to sell quickly for medical expenses. My first investment was a tiny duplex in a neighborhood everyone considered hopeless. The seller was an elderly man whose wife had just gone into long-term care. He needed $25,000 immediately, and he needed it more than he needed market value for his property. I used every penny of my divorce settlement plus a loan against my future alimony payments. To everyone who knew me, it looked like a desperate woman making a foolish decision with the last money she had. 6 months later, the city announced plans for a new transit line that would run right through that neighborhood. My duplex was suddenly worth $90,000. That's when I knew, I told Alexander, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. I knew I could do this. But the money was only part of it. The real transformation happened when I met Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, but a brilliant plastic surgeon who specialized in subtle reconstructive work for women over 50. I don't want to look younger, I told her during our first consultation. I want to look like the best possible version of myself. The surgery was minimal, strategic. A slight lift around the eyes, some work on my neck. Nothing that would scream facelift, but everything that would restore the confidence that 40 years of marriage to Lance had slowly eroded. More importantly, Dr. Warren introduced me to her social circle. Successful women who'd rebuilt their lives after major changes. Women who understood that reinvention wasn't about changing who you were, but about becoming who you'd always been meant to be. That's where I met Margaret Thornton, who introduced me to her financial advisor, who introduced me to her lawyer, who introduced me to investment opportunities I never could have accessed as the struggling ex-wife everyone thought I was. Within 3 years, I'd gone from near poverty to having a net worth of almost $2 million. Not enough to be truly wealthy, but enough to have options, to have power, to have the kind of independence Lance had tried to take away from me. But the real turning point came when I met Alexander. "Tell her about the gallery opening," Alexander said now, refilling our wine glasses with the expensive Bordeaux he loved to share with me. I laughed, remembering that night 4 years ago. I was at this art gallery opening in Beverly Hills, completely out of my usual territory. I'd started attending cultural events because I was studying how wealthy people networked, how they identified opportunities. I'd been standing in front of a particularly abstract painting, trying to look like I belonged, when this attractive man appeared beside me. "Either that's the most profound commentary on modern isolation I've ever seen," he'd said, "or someone spilled paint and decided to call it art." I'd laughed before I could stop myself. I was thinking the same thing, but I didn't want to look unsophisticated. "In my experience," he'd replied, "the most sophisticated people are the ones honest enough to admit when something doesn't make sense." We'd talked for 2 hours that night, not about art, which neither of us particularly understood, but about business, about life, about the strange ways people reinvent themselves when circumstances demand it. He told me about growing up poor in Detroit, about building his first company with borrowed money and borrowed time, about the satisfaction of proving wrong everyone who'd written him off. I told him I was recently divorced, that I was exploring new interests, that I was learning to be independent for the first time in my adult life. I didn't tell him about Lance or Zadie or the systematic destruction of my previous life. Not that night. But somehow, he understood that I was someone in transition, someone becoming, rather than someone who had always been. The attraction was immediate, Alexander said now, his hand finding mine again. But the respect took time to build. He was right. Over the months that followed, as we dated and grew closer, I slowly revealed more of my story. Not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a strategist explaining my long-term plan. Alexander had been fascinated by my approach. Here was a woman who'd been systematically dismantled by people she trusted, who'd responded not with bitterness or revenge fantasies, but with a carefully orchestrated campaign of self-reconstruction. "You weren't just surviving," he'd said after I told him about my real estate investments and my 5-year plan for financial independence. "You were building something better than what you'd lost." Our relationship deepened as we discovered how much we had in common. Both of us understood what it meant to be underestimated. Both of us had learned to use other people's assumptions as weapons. Both of us believed that the best revenge was a life so successful it made your enemies irrelevant. When Alexander proposed, he did it with a business plan. "Marry me," he'd said over dinner at our favorite restaurant, "and let's build something together that's bigger than anything either of us could create alone." He'd been right. Marriage to Alexander didn't just give me love and companionship. It gave me access to a network of power and influence that transformed my small real estate portfolio into something significant. Alexander's friends became my friends. His business connections became mine. His reputation for integrity and success became a shield that protected me from anyone who might want to look too closely at the woman who'd appeared seemingly from nowhere. More importantly, our marriage was a true partnership. Alexander didn't try to manage me or control me the way Lance had. Instead, he supported my decisions, celebrated my successes, and trusted my judgment completely. Together, we'd built Camden Properties West, a subsidiary of his company that I managed independently. In 3 years, we'd developed 6 major projects, created hundreds of jobs, and established ourselves as serious players in the Southern California market. The business that Lance had built over 40 years, we'd surpassed in less than 5. "The irony," I said to Alexander as we watched the last light fade from the sky, "is that Lance actually did me a favor. If he'd stayed faithful, if he'd been content with our life together, I never would have discovered what I was really capable of." Alexander smiled, that warm smile that still made my heart skip after all this time. Some people need to be broken before they can become unbreakable. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and felt my stomach tighten. It was from Zadie. "We need to talk. Tomorrow. It's about what you owe Emma." What I owed Emma. Michael's daughter, the granddaughter I'd never been allowed to meet because Zadie had convinced everyone I was too unstable, too broken, too dangerous to be around a child. I showed Alexander the message. He read it twice, his expression darkening. "They're not done," he said quietly. I looked out at the ocean, at the vast expanse of water that had witnessed countless storms and emerged unchanged. "No," I agreed. "They're not done. But then again, neither am I." The confrontation at the funeral had been just the beginning. Lance and Zadie had spent 8 years believing they'd won completely, that they'd broken me beyond any possibility of recovery. Now they knew better. But knowing and accepting were 2 different things entirely. The real war was just beginning. Zadie and I met at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory that wouldn't give either of us an advantage. She'd chosen the location, probably thinking it would make me feel small and out of place among the young professionals and their expensive coffee drinks. She was wrong about that, like she'd been wrong about everything else. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a simple but well-tailored dress that Alexander had helped me choose. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed money, but everything that whispered confidence. My hair was styled professionally, my makeup subtle but perfect. I looked like exactly what I was, a successful woman who'd learned to present herself with quiet authority. Zadie was already seated when I walked in, and I watched her face carefully as she took in my appearance. The shock was subtle, but unmistakable. This wasn't the broken woman she'd expected to meet. She'd aged in the 8 years since our divorce. Still beautiful at 42, but there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a tension in her posture that suggested the perfect life she'd stolen wasn't quite as perfect as she'd imagined. "Marcia," she said as I sat down across from her, "you look different." "Thank you," I replied, signaling the waitress for coffee. "You wanted to discuss Emma." Zadie shifted uncomfortably, clearly thrown off balance by my directness. She'd probably planned some elaborate manipulation, some way to make me feel guilty about the granddaughter I'd never met. "Yes. Emma is 8 years old now, and she's been asking questions about her father's mother. About you." I sipped my coffee and waited. One thing I'd learned over the past 8 years was the power of silence. People felt compelled to fill it, often revealing more than they intended. "The thing is," Zadie continued, fidgeting with her purse strap, "Lance and I have been protecting her from the truth about your mental state, about how you abandoned Michael." There it was, the same lie they'd been telling for 8 years, so deeply embedded in their version of reality that Zadie probably believed it herself. "And what truth is that exactly?" I asked calmly. Zadie blinked, seeming surprised by my tone. "Well, how you couldn't handle the divorce, how you stopped being part of Michael's life because you were too unstable." I nodded thoughtfully. "That's an interesting interpretation of events." "It's not an interpretation, Marcia. It's what happened." I set down my coffee cup and leaned back in my chair, studying this woman who'd helped destroy my family and then rewritten history to make herself the hero. "Tell me, Zadie, what do you think I've been doing for the past 8 years?" The question clearly caught her off guard. What do you mean? I mean, what did you imagine my life looked like? After the divorce, after losing Michael, after being cut off from my granddaughter, what did you think I was doing with my days?" Zadie's expression grew uncomfortable. "I suppose, trying to get by. Maybe getting some help, hopefully." "Getting help. Yes, you mentioned that I needed professional help quite often, didn't you?" A flush crept up Zadie's neck. She was beginning to realize this conversation wasn't going the way she'd planned. "Look, Marcia, I didn't come here to relitigate the past. I came because Emma deserves to know her grandmother, but only if you're stable enough to be in her life." Stable enough. I repeated her words slowly, tasting them. "And how would you measure my stability, Zadie?" "Well, I'd need to know that you're not going to say inappropriate things to her about her father and me. That you understand your role and your boundaries. My role, my boundaries." This woman who'd stolen my husband and alienated my son was sitting here telling me what my role should be with my own granddaughter. I reached into my purse and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to her. "Camden Properties West," she read aloud, frowning. "Marcia Camden, Chief Executive Officer." She looked up at me, confusion clouding her features. "I don't understand. What is this?" "It's my business card, Zadie, from the company I run." "But your name is Holloway." "Not anymore. I remarried 3 years ago." The color drained from Zadie's face. "You remarried?" "To Alexander Camden. Perhaps you've heard of him?" Camden Industries has been developing properties throughout this region for the past few years. I watched as recognition dawned in her eyes. Everyone in real estate knew Camden Industries. They were the company that had been quietly revolutionizing sustainable development. The company that even Lance's firm had tried desperately to partner with. "That's impossible," Zadie whispered. "Why is it impossible?" "Because you were." "I was what, Zadie? Broken? Pathetic? Too damaged to ever recover from what you and Lance did to me." Zadie's mouth opened and closed without sound. The carefully constructed narrative she'd been living in was crumbling around her. I leaned forward slightly, my voice remaining calm and conversational. Did you really think I stayed frozen in that moment forever? Did you think I never moved past the role you cast me in? But Lance said, he said you were barely surviving. He said you couldn't even afford. Lance said a lot of things, I interrupted. Most of them were lies designed to make you both feel better about what you'd done. Zadie was staring at the business card like it might bite her. How long have you been? How long has this been? 8 years, Zadie. I've been building this life for 8 years. While you were playing house in my old home, raising my granddaughter to believe I was too unstable to love her, I was creating something Lance could never have imagined. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of 8 years of assumptions collapsing. But you disappeared, Zadie said finally, her voice small. After the divorce, you just vanished. I became invisible, I corrected. There's a difference. Invisible means people stop seeing you, stop thinking about you, stop considering you a threat. It's actually a very useful state to be in when you're planning a comeback. Zadie shook her head slowly. I don't understand any of this. You were broken. Lance said you were calling and begging, that you were desperate. When did Lance say that? When? I don't know. Throughout the years. Whenever I worried that maybe we'd been too harsh, he'd remind me how you'd fallen apart, how you'd proven you weren't stable enough to be around Emma. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Zadie, I haven't spoken to Lance since the day our divorce was finalized. Not once in 8 years. Every story he told you about my begging or my desperation was a complete fabrication. The impact of that revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and I could see her mind racing, re-examining years of conversations, years of justifications for keeping me away from my granddaughter. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice barely audible. Because you said Emma has been asking about me. And because I think it's time she met her real grandmother, not the fictional villain you and Lance created. Zadie was quiet for a long time, staring at her untouched coffee. When she finally looked up, there was something different in her eyes. Fear, maybe. Or the first glimmer of understanding about what she'd really lost when she chose to destroy me instead of simply taking what she wanted. What do you want from us? She asked. I want to know my granddaughter. I want her to know that she has a grandmother who's built a successful business, who's created jobs for hundreds of people, who's married to a man who loves and respects her. I want her to know that strength isn't about destroying other people. It's about building something they can't tear down. Zadie nodded slowly, tears starting to form in her eyes. Lance is going to. When he finds out about this, about what you've become, Lance is going to realize that his greatest mistake wasn't leaving me, I said quietly. It was underestimating me. I stood up, leaving money on the table for both of our coffees. Think about what I've said, Zadie. Emma deserves to know the truth about her grandmother. All of it. As I walked toward the door, Zadie called out behind me. Marcia? Why did you let us believe you were broken for so long? Why didn't you fight back sooner? I turned back to her, and for the first time in our conversation, I smiled. Because the best revenge isn't immediate, Zadie. The best revenge is a life so successful that your enemies become irrelevant. I needed time to build that life. And now? Now I have it. And you're about to discover what that means. I left her sitting there, probably wondering how many other lies Lance had told her, how many other truths she'd been blind to. But more importantly, she was probably beginning to realize that the war she thought they'd won 8 years ago had never actually ended. It had just moved to a battlefield where I held all the advantages. The drive home gave me time to think about what came next. Zadie would tell Lance about our conversation, probably tonight. Lance would deny everything at first, then rage about my audacity in daring to rebuild my life without his permission. But eventually, they'd both have to confront the reality that they'd spent 8 years celebrating a victory that had never actually happened. I'd let them believe they'd destroyed me because it served my purposes. But now those purposes had changed. Now it was time for them to understand that Marcia Holloway, the broken, pathetic woman they'd discarded, had never really existed. She'd been a character I played, a role I inhabited while I became someone else entirely. Someone they'd never seen coming. 3 months after my meeting with Zadie, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. My assistant buzzed me on the intercom, her voice uncertain. "Mrs. Camden? There's a young girl here to see you. She says she's your granddaughter." My heart stopped. "Send her in." Emma walked through my office door like she owned the world, all 8 years of her radiating the same confidence Michael had possessed at that age. She had his dark hair and my green eyes, and she was absolutely beautiful. "Are you really my grandmother?" she asked without preamble, studying my face with the direct gaze children use when they're determined to see through adult nonsense. "I am," I said, coming around my desk to kneel at her eye level. "I'm Marcia." "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Emma." She tilted her head, considering me. "You don't look crazy." Despite everything, I laughed. "Do I look like I should be crazy?" "Daddy said you were sick in your brain, and that's why I couldn't meet you." But Zadie told him that wasn't true. They had a big fight about it. I could imagine that fight. Zadie, armed with the knowledge of what I'd really become, confronting Lance about 8 years of lies. Lance, cornered and desperate, probably lashing out at everyone within reach. "Sometimes adults say things that aren't true when they're scared," I told Emma carefully. "Your daddy wasn't being mean on purpose. He was just confused about some things." Emma nodded solemnly. "Zadie says you're really rich now and you have a big house by the ocean." "I do have a house by the ocean. Would you like to see it sometime?" Her face lit up. "Can I? Zadie says you're married to a nice man who builds buildings." "I am. His name is Alexander, and I think you'd like him. He builds beautiful buildings that don't hurt the environment." For the next hour, Emma and I talked about everything 8-year-olds find important: her school, her friends, her pet hamster named Mr. Whiskers. She was bright and funny and completely unspoiled despite the chaos that had surrounded her young life. When Zadie came to pick her up, she lingered in the doorway of my office, watching Emma hug me goodbye. "She asked to come," Zadie said quietly, after Emma went to wait in the reception area. "She's been asking about you constantly since our conversation. Lance is. He's not handling any of this well." "I imagine not," I replied. "Having your entire worldview collapsed tends to be unsettling." Zadie looked around my office, taking in the awards on the walls, the photos of development projects, the obvious signs of success and authority. "I owe you an apology," she said suddenly. "For all of it. For believing Lance's lies. For keeping Emma away from you. For being part of what they did to you." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected: genuine remorse. "You were young," I said finally, "and Lance was very convincing. That's not an excuse. I should have questioned things more. I should have tried to understand your side of the story." "Would it have changed anything?" Zadie was quiet for a long moment. "Probably not," she admitted. "I was so desperate to justify what we'd done, to believe that we deserved happiness more than you did. And now I see what we really did. We didn't just steal your husband, Marcia. We stole 8 years of your granddaughter's life. 8 years of her knowing she had a grandmother who could have loved her, supported her, been part of her world." The pain in her voice seemed genuine, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel toward Zadie. "Pity. Emma can know me now," I said gently. "The past doesn't have to define the future." Zadie nodded, wiping at her eyes. "Lance doesn't agree. He says you're manipulating Emma, that you're trying to turn her against us. He's talking about moving away, taking Emma somewhere you can't find her." My blood went cold. He can't do that. He's her legal guardian now that Michael is gone, and he's terrified of what you might tell her about him. I felt the familiar rage building in my chest, but I pushed it down. This wasn't the time for anger. This was the time for strategy. "What do you think I should do, Zadie?" The question seemed to surprise her. I think you should fight for her. Emma needs to know her grandmother. She needs to know that women can be strong, that they can rebuild their lives even after terrible things happen to them. That evening, I sat with Alexander on our terrace, watching Emma play in the infinity pool. Zadie had agreed to let her spend the weekend with us, despite Lance's furious objections. "She's remarkable," Alexander said, watching Emma demonstrate her underwater handstands. "She has your determination, and Michael's fearlessness," I added. "Look at how she just dove right into a new situation, a new relationship. No hesitation, no fear, unlike her grandfather." I laughed. Lance was always afraid of anything he couldn't control. That's why he destroyed our marriage instead of working on it. That's why he's threatening to take Emma away instead of accepting that she has room in her life for both grandmothers. Alexander took my hand. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to give him a choice." The next Monday, I drove to Lance's office. He was still running his small real estate company, though it was clearly struggling. The building was shabby, the reception area dated, everything about the place screaming of a business that had stopped growing and started dying. Lance kept me waiting for 20 minutes, a petty power play that might have worked on the woman I used to be. When his secretary finally ushered me into his office, he was sitting behind his desk trying to look important. The years hadn't been kind to him. At 72, he looked older than his age, his face deeply lined, his hands spotted and trembling slightly. The confident man who'd once destroyed my life had become a bitter old man clinging to past victories. "Marcia," he said without standing, "I should have known you'd come crawling back eventually." I sat down across from him without being invited, crossing my legs and settling back in my chair like I owned the place. "Hello, Lance. You look tired." His face flushed. "Don't you dare come in here and pretend to be concerned about me. We both know why you're here." "Do we? Why don't you tell me? You want access to Emma? You think because you've managed to fool Zadie with whatever game you're playing, you can manipulate your way back into our family?" "Our family." I repeated the words thoughtfully. "That's interesting phrasing, considering Emma is my granddaughter, not yours. I'm the only grandfather she's ever known. Michael was my son in every way that mattered." The casual dismissal of my relationship with Michael hit its target, but I didn't flinch. I'd had 8 years to process that loss, to understand that the man sitting across from me had poisoned my son against me through years of calculated manipulation. "You're right," I said calmly. "You were Michael's father figure for most of his adult life, and now you're Emma's guardian. That's a lot of responsibility." Lance frowned, clearly expecting more of a fight. "The question is," I continued, "what kind of guardian are you going to be? The kind who helps Emma understand her full family history, or the kind who cuts her off from people who love her because of your own insecurities?" "Insecurities?" Lance's voice rose. "You think this is about insecurity?" "I think this is about a 72-year-old man who's terrified that his 8-year-old granddaughter might learn the truth about what he did to her grandmother." Lance stood up abruptly, his chair spinning behind him. "I didn't do anything to you that you didn't deserve. Our marriage was dead, Marcia. Dead for years. I found love with Zadie, and you couldn't handle it. Is that what you tell yourself? That our marriage was already dead when you started sleeping with my daughter-in-law in our bed? That's ancient history. Not to Emma, it isn't. To Emma, it's her family history, her story. And she has a right to know all of it, not just the version you've carefully edited." I stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the parking lot where Alexander was waiting in the Bentley. "Here's what's going to happen, Lance. You're going to stop threatening to take Emma away. You're going to allow her to have a relationship with me. And you're going to do it gracefully, without drama, without making an 8-year-old girl feel guilty for loving her grandmother." Lance laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And why exactly would I do that?" I turned back to him, and for the first time in our conversation, I smiled. "Because if you don't, I'm going to tell Emma the truth. All of it. About how you cheated on me with her stepmother. About how you lied to her father about my mental state to keep him away from me. About how you've spent 8 years spreading false stories to justify stealing my family." Lance's face went white. "You wouldn't. She's just a child. She's a bright child who's already asking questions about why she was never allowed to meet her grandmother. How long do you think it will be before she starts putting the pieces together on her own?" Zadie would never let you. Zadie already knows the truth. We had a very enlightening conversation about the lies you told her over the years. The silence in the room was deafening. Lance slowly sank back into his chair, looking every one of his 72 years. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want to be part of Emma's life. I want regular visitation. I want her to know my husband, and I want the freedom to build a relationship with her without interference from you. And in exchange? In exchange, I'll let her keep loving the grandfather she's always known. I won't poison her against you the way you poisoned Michael against me." Lance stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to figure out if there was another way out of this trap. "You've really changed," he said finally. "No, Lance. I've really become myself. The woman I was always supposed to be before I let you convince me I was smaller than I am." I moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. If you ever try to take Emma away from me again, if you ever make her feel guilty for loving me, or if you ever spread another lie about my mental state, I will make sure she knows exactly what kind of man her grandfather really is." I left him sitting in his shabby office, probably wondering how the broken woman he'd discarded had become someone who could back him into a corner with nothing but the truth. 6 months later, Emma spent her 9th birthday weekend at our Malibu house. She'd invited 3 school friends, and Alexander had hired a party planner to create the kind of celebration every little girl dreams about. As I watched my granddaughter blow out her candles, surrounded by friends who thought having a grandmother with an ocean view mansion was perfectly normal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in nearly a decade: complete peace. Lance had kept his word. Emma came to visit us every other weekend, and I was included in school events and family celebrations. He was polite when necessary, distant when possible, but he no longer stood between me and my granddaughter. More importantly, Emma was thriving. She had her stepmother Zadie, who genuinely loved her, her grandfather Lance, who provided stability, and now her grandmother Marcia, who showed her that women could be strong and successful and independent. "Make a wish, sweetheart," I called out as Emma prepared to blow out her candles. She closed her eyes tight, made her wish, and blew out all 9 candles in one breath. "What did you wish for?" Alexander asked, wrapping his arm around my waist. Emma grinned. "I can't tell you, or it won't come true, but it's about our family. Our family. Not the family that had been destroyed by betrayal and lies, but the family we'd rebuilt from the ashes. Imperfect, complicated, but real." As I tucked Emma into bed that night in the guest room we decorated just for her, she looked up at me with those serious green eyes. "Grandma Marcia, can I ask you something?" "Anything, sweetheart." "Were you really sad for a long time, before you met Grandpa Alexander?" I smoothed her hair back from her forehead, choosing my words carefully. "I was sad for a while," I said honestly. "But sometimes when bad things happen, they help us become stronger. They help us figure out who we really are underneath all the things other people expect us to be." Emma nodded solemnly. "Like when I was scared to try diving, but then I did it and found out I was really good at it? Exactly like that." "I'm glad the sad time helped you become strong, Grandma, because now I get to know you, and you're the best grandmother ever." As I kissed her goodnight and turned off the lights, I thought about the woman I'd been 8 years ago. Broken, betrayed, convinced that her life was over at 58. That woman couldn't have imagined this moment. Couldn't have envisioned a granddaughter who saw strength instead of weakness, success instead of failure, love instead of abandonment. The best revenge I'd learned wasn't destroying the people who hurt you. The best revenge was building a life so beautiful that their betrayal became irrelevant. Standing in the doorway watching Emma sleep, I finally understood that I'd won something better than victory. I'd won my freedom. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.